Please, Uncle Silas, the soot is inside me again. I can feel it scratching when I breathe, the boy whispered, his voice a dry rattle that seemed to echo the rhythmic thud of the distant steam hammers. 12-year-old Pip sat on a crate in the corner of a damp, draughty stable, his small frame shaking with a cough that threatened to tear his lungs apart. Outside, the Yorkshire moors were swallowed by a thick yellow fog, a mixture of natural mist and the sulphurous belch of Lord Julian Vane's iron foundries. In the flickering orange light of a single tallow candle, Pip's face was a map of exhaustion, his skin permanently stained grey by the coal dust of the Clapperboy pits. He reached out a trembling hand, clutching a tarnished brass whistle that hung around his neck, the only thing he owned that wasn't covered in grime. "Hold on, little bird," Silas Reed replied, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "I will find something to quiet the scratching, I promise." But as Silas leaned into the candlelight, he didn't look like a savior. He looked like a nightmare. His face was caked in a thick, cracked mask of white, lead-based grease paint. High, exaggerated red arches were painted over his eyebrows, and a wide, permanent grin was smeared across his mouth in the color of dried blood. He wore a tunic of mismatched rags, silks and velvets stolen from the scrap heaps of the wealthy, stitched together in a chaotic kaleidoscope of colors. To the world of 1880s Yorkshire, he was the jester of Blackwood Manor. To Lord Vane, he was a trophy. To himself, he was a man waiting for the world to burn. Before we go deeper into the dark corridors of Blackwood Manor and the terrible secret Pip is carrying, I want to ask you a favor. If you find yourself captivated by this tale of shadows and justice, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. It truly helps us bring these forgotten stories to life. And as the mystery unfolds, I'd love for you to leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10. Let me know how this story is touching your soul. Now stay with me until the very end, because the laughter you are about to hear is not what it seems. The air in Blackwood was heavy, not just with the smell of coal, but with the suffocating weight of power. Lord Julian Vane, the Iron King, ruled this valley like a god of grease and gears. He believed that the poor were merely fuel for his ambitions, and Silas Reed was his favorite plaything. 10 years ago, Silas had been a man of science, a chemist with a clean face and a bright future. He had owned a small apothecary and a patch of land that stood exactly where Vane wanted to lay his private railway. Vane didn't buy the land, he stole it. He orchestrated a mishap. A batch of tonic from Silas's shop was contaminated with arsenic. People died. Silas's reputation was incinerated in a single afternoon. His wife Mary, unable to bear the shame and the sudden, crushing poverty, succumbed to a fever in a pauper's grave while Silas was rotting in a cell, waiting for a trial that Vane had already bought and paid for. When Silas was finally released, he was a ghost. Vane, with a cruelty that only the truly bored can possess, offered him a job. He didn't want a chemist. He wanted a fool. He wanted the man he ruined to dance for his dinner. Now, Silas moved through the manor like a colourful shadow. He was forced to perform dark satires for the visiting aristocracy, mocking the very class he once aspired to join. He would tumble, juggle, and recite biting rhymes, while the lords and ladies sipped sherry and laughed at the broken man in the paint. They didn't see the chemist's eyes behind the mask. They didn't see the way his hands stayed steady, even when Vane kicked him like a stray dog. But Silas had a reason to endure the humiliation. Pip. The boy was the son of a fellow foundry worker who had been crushed by a falling piston years ago. Silas had taken him in, hiding him in the corners of the estate, feeding him scraps from the great hall. Pip was a miracle of mimicry. He could imitate the trill of a skylark, the hiss of a steam valve, or the precise cold cadence of Lord Vane's voice. It was this talent that had led Pip into the forbidden depths of Vane's study. "I saw it, Uncle," Pip whispered that night in the stable, his eyes wide with a terror that no child should know. "The Black Ledger. He keeps it in the floorboards under the heavy oak desk. It's full of names, names of judges, names of the men who helped him take your shop. It says how much he paid for the unfortunate accidents at the foundry." Silas felt a cold shiver race down his spine. The Black Ledger wasn't just a book, it was a death warrant. If Vane knew the boy had seen it, Pip wouldn't last the night. The Iron King didn't leave witnesses, he left mishaps. You must never speak of it again, Pip, Silas said, gripping the boy's shoulders. Do you hear me? Not a word, not a sound. If he suspects— He already does, Pip coughed, a spray of red staining his sleeve. He looked at me today, Uncle, at the foundry. He didn't yell, he just smiled, like a wolf watching a rabbit. He told the foreman I was too small for the clappers. He said he had a special role for me at the Grand Jubilee. The Grand Jubilee. It was the event of the decade. Lord Vane had been nominated for the Queen's Privy Council, and he was throwing a celebration that would cement his status as an untouchable titan of industry. The manor was being draped in velvet and gold. The finest wines were being brought up from the cellar. It was a victory lap, built on the bones of 1,000 broken families. Silas knew he had to act. He was a chemist, and though his laboratory was gone, his knowledge remained. The next morning, under the guise of gathering wildflowers for the Jubilee's table arrangements, Silas slipped into the manor's neglected conservatory. It was a glass-walled tomb, overgrown with exotic plants that Vane had imported and then forgotten. The air was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and rot. He searched through the tangled vines and the poisonous belladonna, looking for something to soothe Pip's cough. But then, in a dark, shaded corner where the glass was cracked and the moss grew thick, he saw them. A cluster of mushrooms, deceptively beautiful. They were a pale, ghostly gold with delicate veils that looked like lace. Silas froze. He recognized them from the ancient herbals he had studied in his youth. Amanita rhesus. The locals called them the fool's mushroom. In small doses, the toxins within the mushroom acted on the nervous system, inducing a state of uncontrollable euphoric laughter. But in a concentrated dose, the laughter became a physical convulsion. It would cause the diaphragm to seize, the heart to race until it burst, and the capillaries in the lungs to rupture. It was a death of pure, agonizing mirth. The gilded death. Silas stared at the mushrooms. He could hear the distant rhythmic thud of the hammers. Thump, 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 like a clock ticking toward Pip's end. He looked at his own hands, stained with the white lead paint he could never truly wash off. He was the jester. He was the fool. And here, growing in the dirt, was his punchline. But a war raged inside him. He had taken an oath as a healer once. He had spent his life trying to save people from the very poisons he now contemplated using. If he did this, he would be no better than Vane. He would be a murderer. And if he were caught, which was almost certain, who would protect Pip? Who would ensure the boy didn't end up in a workhouse or a shallow grave? Is that for the centerpiece, Jester? Silas jumped, nearly crushing the mushrooms under his boot. Standing at the entrance of the conservatory was Lord Julian Vane himself. He looked every inch the aristocrat in his charcoal frock coat, his silver-headed cane clicking against the stone floor. His eyes, cold and sharp as industrial diamonds, scanned the room. Just looking for something with a bit of character, my lord, Silas replied, bowing low, his rags fluttering. The white paint on his face felt like a heavy, cold weight. Vane stepped closer, the smell of expensive tobacco and coal smoke following him. He pointed his cane at the golden mushrooms. Those look festive, bright, like gold coins. Make sure they find their way to the high table. I want everything to be perfect for the Jubilee. I've decided to involve your little ward as well, the Clapper boy. Silas felt his heart stop. The boy is ill, my lord. He would only be a distraction. Nonsense, Vane sneered, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. He has a gift for voices, doesn't he? I thought it would be amusing to have him perform with you. A jester in his shadow act. He can mimic the guests. We'll see who has the best wit in Yorkshire. Tell him to be ready. If he fails to entertain, I'll find a much darker place for him than a stable. Vane turned and walked away, his cane clicking a steady, arrogant rhythm. Silas stood in the silence of the conservatory, the golden mushrooms shimmering in the dim light. The choice had been made for him. Vane wasn't just taking his past, he was taking Pip's future. He was going to turn the boy's innocence into a circus act before discarding him. Silas reached down and carefully plucked the Amanita rhesus. He didn't feel like a healer anymore. He felt like an executioner. He took the mushrooms back to his small hidden corner of the stables and began the work. Using a makeshift mortar and pestle fashioned from a flat stone and a heavy iron bolt, he ground the mushrooms into a fine, pale powder. He then began the delicate process of extraction, using a small spirit lamp and a glass vial he had hidden away for years. As the liquid simmered, the room filled with a faint, sweet scent, like overripe peaches. Silas watched the bubbles rise, his mind racing. He needed a vessel, something that would bypass the king's tasters, something that would be seen as a gesture of ultimate submission. His eyes fell on a heavy crystal wine decanter he had seen in the manor's pantry. It was a masterpiece of glasswork, reserved only for Vane's most expensive vintages. If he could spike the wine during the height of the Jubilee, when the gas lights were low and the guests were distracted by the performance. But as he worked, a thought haunted him. This is just the beginning. The poison would kill the man, but it wouldn't kill the system. To truly destroy Vane, he needed the Black Ledger. He needed to show the world the blood that stained the Iron King's gold. He looked at Pip, who was sleeping fitfully on a pile of straw, his small chest heaving with every labored breath. The boy's brass whistle glinted in the moonlight. Silas realized then that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about a final performance, a play where the jester would finally speak the truth and the king would finally listen, with a laughter that would never end. The stage was set. The invitations had been sent. The elite of England were descending upon Blackwood Manor, unaware that they were walking into a theatre of shadows. Silas Reed, the man in the white mask, began to paint his face for the last time. He added a little more red to the grin. He made the eyebrows a little sharper. "Tonight, Pip," Silas whispered as he tucked the small vial into the folds of his colourful rags. "Tonight, the world is going to laugh with us." But he knew as the first carriage arrived at the gates that once the laughter started, there would be no turning back. The fool's mushroom was ready, the Iron King was waiting, and the clock was ticking. The iron gates of Blackwood Manor groaned as they swung open to admit the first wave of carriages, their wheels crunching over the gravel like teeth grinding on bone. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was electric with a frantic, desperate energy. Servants scurried through the corridors like mice in the walls, polishing silver until it gleamed like blades and hanging heavy velvet drapes to block out the sight of the soot-stained sky. The Grand Jubilee was no longer a distant threat. It was a hungry beast at the door, and Silas Reed could feel its breath on his neck. In the shadows of the pantry, Silas watched as the head steward, a man named Miller with eyes as cold and grey as the Yorkshire rain, inspected the crystal decanters. Among them was the centrepiece, the heavy, diamond-cut vessel that would hold Lord Vane's private vintage. Silas felt the small glass vial hidden in the lining of his tattered jester's tunic, its weight pressing against his ribs like a guilty secret. He had refined the extract of the Amanita rhesus into a clear, odourless syrup. A single drop would cause a fit of giggles. A spoonful would turn the world into a kaleidoscope of madness. The entire vial, that would ensure the Iron King's final breath was a scream disguised as a laugh. But getting close to that decanter was becoming an impossible task. Lord Vane had hired a dozen private guards, rough men from the city who wore constables' uniforms, but carried the stench of the docks and the cruelty of the foundries. They stood at every entrance, their hands resting on heavy truncheons. Vane was a man who knew he was hated, and as his power grew, so did his paranoia. He wasn't just celebrating his appointment to the Queen's Privy Council, he was fortifying his kingdom. "Move along, fool," Miller snapped, his voice cutting through Silas's thoughts. "Lord Vane wants you in the Great Hall for the rehearsal, and bring the boy. If he's still coughing, tell him to choke on it quietly. His lordship won't have the music ruined by a gutter rat's wheezing." Silas bowed, the bells on his pointed hat giving a pathetic, lonely jingle. "Of course, Mr. Miller. The boy will be perfect. He has a voice like an angel. Or a ghost, depending on the light." He found Pip in the stables, huddled under a moth-eaten blanket. The boy's skin was the colour of parchment, and his eyes were sunken, rimmed with a feverish red. Every time he breathed, a wet, whistling sound escaped his chest, the grinder's asthma taking its final toll. Silas knelt beside him, his painted white face looking like a death mask in the dim light. He reached out to stroke Pip's hair, but his hand trembled. "I can't do the voices today, Uncle Silas," Pip whispered, clutching the brass whistle so hard his knuckles were white. "The Iron King, he was in my dreams. He was eating the ledger, swallowing the names of the dead, and his teeth were made of railway spikes." "Shh, little bird," Silas murmured, his heart breaking in a way that no medicine could fix. "You don't have to do the voices for him. You just have to hold on. Tonight, the music changes. Tonight, we find the book." But as Silas helped the boy to his feet, he realized the magnitude of the obstacle before them. Vane didn't just want a performance, he wanted a ritual of humiliation. During the rehearsal in the Great Hall, Vane sat in his high-backed velvet chair, sipping brandy while Silas tumbled and cracked jokes that tasted like ash in his mouth. Pip stood to the side, his small body shaking. "Mimic the bishop, boy," Vane shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Let us hear how the holy man sounds when he's asking for a bribe to bless my new foundry." Pip took a shaky breath and opened his mouth. The voice that came out was a perfect, chilling imitation of the local bishop, pompous, wheezing, and dripping with false piety. The guards laughed, a harsh, metallic sound, but halfway through the sentence, Pip collapsed into a violent fit of coughing. He fell to his knees, his small hands clawing at the air. Silas rushed to him, but Vane's cane slammed down on the floor, the silver head cracking against the stone just inches from Silas's fingers. "Leave him," Vane commanded, his eyes narrowing. "He's a clapper boy, Reed. They're built to be broken. If he dies on the floor, he'll be more useful as a prop than a performer. Perhaps you can juggle his bones for the Queen's ministers?" The cruelty in Vane's voice was absolute. It wasn't just anger. It was a total lack of recognition that the boy was a human being. To Vane, Pip was a gear that had slipped, a coal that had burned out. In that moment, Silas's internal conflict, the lingering ghost of the healer he once was, finally died. The man who had once promised to do no harm was gone. In his place was a jester who understood that some weeds couldn't be trimmed. They had to be poisoned at the root. As they were dismissed, Pip leaned close to Silas's ear, his voice a mere thread of sound. "Under the desk, Uncle? The floorboard with the knot that looks like an eye. He checked it twice during the rehearsal. He thinks nobody is watching, but I see everything. I see the ghosts behind him. The Black Ledger. It was the key to everything. Without it, Vane's death would just be a tragedy, a mysterious illness that would leave his empire to an equally cruel successor. But with the ledger, the entire rotten structure of Blackwood would come crashing down. Silas knew he had to get into the study, but the room was locked and guarded day and night. But wait, Silas thought, his chemist's mind beginning to spark. Paranoia is a poison of its own. He spent the afternoon in the servants' quarters, listening to the gossip. He heard about the journalist, a man named Holloway, who had arrived in town under a false name. Holloway was a man who had been trying to expose Vane for years, only to have his printing presses smashed and his family threatened. He was here, hiding in a local inn, waiting for a scrap of truth to flee the manor. Silas realized that he couldn't just kill Vane, he had to orchestrate a collapse. The symbol of the wine decanter became more than a weapon, it was a timer. Once the poison was served, the chaos would begin. That would be his only window to reach the study, retrieve the ledger and get it to Pip. But as the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows over the moors, a new obstacle emerged. Miller, the steward, approached Silas with a cruel grin. "His lordship has changed the program," Miller said, tossing a new set of rags at Silas's feet. "You're not just performing, you're the wine-bearer. You will serve the king his vintage in front of everyone. And the boy? He's to be chained to the chair next to the king, a loyal subject at his master's feet." Chained. The word hit Silas like a physical blow. If Pip was chained to the chair, Silas wouldn't be able to get him away in the chaos. He wouldn't be able to protect him from the guards once the poison took hold. "You look pale, Jester," Miller mocked. "Is the lead paint getting into your brain? Or are you just realizing that you're nothing but a dog in a costume?" Silas looked down at the floor, his mind spinning. The plan was falling apart before it had even begun. If he poisoned the wine now, he would be sentencing Pip to death as well. The guards would slaughter everyone in the room once the king began his gilded death. He had to find a way to break the chains, to get the ledger, and to get Pip to safety, all while the most powerful men in England watched. "I'll be ready," Silas whispered, his voice steady despite the storm in his soul. "The king will have a night he never forgets." In the hours leading up to the Jubilee, Silas sat alone in the dark. He thought of Mary. He thought of the small apothecary with the smell of lavender and dried chamomile. He thought of the man he used to be, a man who believed that logic and law could protect the innocent. He realized now that the law was just a cloak that men like Vane wore to hide their daggers. To fight a monster, you couldn't use a shield, you had to use a mirror. You had to show the monster its own reflection until it screamed. The turning point came when he saw a young kitchen maid, her eyes red from crying, carrying a tray of coal to Vane's study. She was shaking so hard the coals rattled. Silas stepped into her path, his bells jingling softly. "A heavy burden for such a small thing," he said, his voice gentle. He yelled at me," she sobbed. "He said if I dropped a single ember on his rug, he'd have me sent to the workhouse. He's a devil, Mr. Reed, a devil in a silk suit." "He is," Silas agreed, "but devils are afraid of the dark. Tell me, is the guard still at the door?" "No," she sniffled. "He's gone to the great hall to help move the tables. There's only the big lock now." The guard was gone. For 10 minutes the study was vulnerable. Silas didn't hesitate. He knew the risk. If he was caught in the study, there would be no Jubilee for him, only a rope. But he also knew that this was his only chance to find the ledger before the wine was poured. He slipped through the back corridors, his colourful rags making him look like a flickering flame in the dim gaslight. He reached the heavy oak door of the study. He took out a small, thin piece of wire, a chemist's tool he had kept hidden for years. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic sound that drowned out the distant factory hammers. Click. The door swung open. The room smelled of old paper, expensive brandy, and the metallic tang of Vane's soul. Silas moved to the desk, his eyes searching the floorboards. There it was, the knot that looked like an eye. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he pried at the wood. It gave way with a soft groan. Tucked inside a velvet-lined hollow was a book bound in black leather. He pulled it out, and as he flipped through the pages, the horror of Vane's empire was laid bare. Names of children who had disappeared in the foundries. Records of bribes paid to the magistrates who had sent Silas to prison. It was a map of a decade of suffering. But as he moved to tuck the book into his tunic, the door creaked. Silas froze. The shadow of a man fell across the rug. "Looking for some light reading, Jester?" Silas turned, the black ledger clutched to his chest. Standing in the doorway was not a guard, and not Lord Vane. It was Pip. But the boy wasn't alone. Behind him, holding him by the collar of his neck, was Miller. The steward's face was twisted into a mask of triumph. "I knew you were a rat," Miller hissed. "I knew you were looking for something. And now I have the book, and I have the boy. Lord Vane will be so pleased. He's always wanted a reason to finish what he started 10 years ago. The situation had gone from desperate to catastrophic. The ledger was in plain sight. Pip was a hostage, and the Grand Jubilee was about to begin. Silas looked at the vial of Amanita Rhesus in his pocket, then at the boy's terrified eyes. "But you see, Mr. Miller," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "the thing about a jester is, you never know when the joke is over." He took a step forward, and as he did, the distant sound of the first ballroom waltz began to play. The Jubilee had started. The king was waiting for his wine, and the laughter, the terrible, bloody laughter, was just a heartbeat away. The heavy oak door of the study creaked as Miller tightened his grip on Pip's collar. The steward's eyes were wide with a greedy, murderous light. He had the jester, he had the orphan, and most importantly, he had the evidence that could either destroy Lord Vane or make Miller a very rich man through blackmail. But he had forgotten one thing. A man who has lost everything but a child's life is the most dangerous creature in all of England. "I'll take that book now, Reed," Miller hissed, reaching out with a meaty hand. "And then I'll see you both in the cellar. His lordship has a very specific way of dealing with thieves." Silas didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, his white-painted face illuminated by the flickering gaslight like a ghost. He looked at Pip, whose small face was twisted in pain and terror. Silas felt the weight of the poison vial in his pocket. He could end Miller right now, but that would bring the guards running. He needed silence. He needed a miracle. "Miller, where are you? The guests are arriving and the wine is not yet poured." The voice boomed from the hallway, cold and sharp. Miller froze. It was the voice of Lord Julian Vane. The steward's grip on Pip loosened for a fraction of a second as he turned his head toward the door. In that heartbeat, Pip didn't hesitate. He didn't scream for help. Instead, he opened his mouth and projected a voice that wasn't his own. It was a perfect, rasping imitation of the head guard Barker. "Mr. Miller, there's a fire in the stables. Get the men, now." The mimicry was so flawless that Miller gasped, his eyes darting toward the window. In that moment of confusion, Silas lunged. He didn't use a knife. He used the heavy iron bolt he had been using as a pestle. He struck Miller across the temple with a sickening thud. The steward slumped to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the rug. Silas grabbed Pip, pulling him close. "The ledger, Pip, take it. Run to the back gate. There is a man there, Mr. Halloway. He is a journalist. Give him the book and these coins. Tell him the jester sent you." "But Uncle Silas, what about you?" Pip whispered, his voice cracking. "I have one final performance to give, little bird," Silas said, his eyes burning with a cold, clear fire. "If I run now, they will hunt us both. But if the king falls tonight, nobody will be looking for a clapper boy. Go. Breathe the air outside the moors, Pip. Breathe for me." He shoved the black ledger and a small pouch of stolen gold into Pip's hands. With one last look at the boy who had become his soul, Silas watched him disappear into the shadows of the servants' passage. Then Silas turned back to the room. He took the vial of Amanita Rhesus and stepped out into the corridor. The music from the great hall was growing louder, a frantic, swirling waltz that sounded like the heartbeat of a dying era. The great hall of Blackwood Manor was a cathedral of excess. Huge crystal chandeliers dripped with light, casting a golden glow over the hundreds of aristocrats, industrialists, and high-ranking clergy who filled the room. At the head of the long table sat Lord Julian Vane, flanked by a bishop and a minister of the crown. Vane looked like a god of iron and silk, his chest heaving with the pride of a man who believed he had finally conquered fate. "And now," Vane announced, his voice cutting through the chatter, "to celebrate our glorious future, let the wine be poured. Jester, to your duties." Silas emerged from the shadows, his bells jingling in a slow, funeral rhythm. He carried the heavy, diamond-cut crystal decanter on a silver tray. His face was a mask of perfect, terrifying submission. As he approached the high table, he felt the eyes of the elite upon him. They saw a fool in colorful rags. They didn't see the chemist. They didn't see the drop of clear, sweet-smelling syrup he had swirled into the vintage just seconds before. He reached Lord Vane. With a steady hand, he poured the dark, blood-red wine into the king's glass. Then he poured for the bishop. Then for the minister. "A toast, my lord?" Silas asked, his voice melodic and strange. Vane laughed, grabbing the glass. "A toast to the Iron King and to the fools who serve him." The room erupted in cheers as the elite raised their glasses. Vane drained half the glass in one gulp, his throat working as he swallowed the gilded death. Silas stood perfectly still, watching. "Now, Jester," Vane said, wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief. "Entertain us. Give us a rhyme for our new position on the council." Silas stepped back into the center of the hall. The gaslights were dimmed, leaving the room in a flickering orange glow from the massive hearth. Silas began to speak, but he didn't tumble. He didn't juggle. His voice rose, cold and clear, filling every corner of the silent room. "A king of iron, a king of smoke, who built his throne on a cruel joke. He steals the land and he grinds the bone and thinks he sits on a godlike throne. But look at the glass, and look at the red. The ghosts of the foundry are no longer dead." The smile on Vane's face faltered. He let out a small, dry chuckle. "A bit dark tonight, isn't it, Reed?" But the chuckle didn't stop. It grew. Vane laughed again, a little louder this time. Then the bishop began to giggle. The minister joined in, a high-pitched, manic sound that seemed out of place in the grand hall. At first the guests laughed with them, thinking it was part of the act. The room was filled with a chorus of high society mirth. But justice, it seems, has a wicked sense of timing. Vane's laughter changed. It became jagged, rhythmic, and uncontrollable. He tried to take a breath, but it came out as a bark of hysterical joy. He clutched his throat, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. Beside him, the bishop fell forward, his forehead hitting the table as he roared with a laughter that sounded like a saw cutting through wood. "Stop! Stop it!" Vane gasped, but the words were swallowed by a fresh wave of convulsions. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He collapsed onto the Persian rug, his body twitching in time with his barks of mirth. The guests watched in mounting horror. This wasn't a performance. Vane was clawing at his chest, his eyes bulging, his mouth stretched into a wide, horrific grin that he couldn't close. A thin line of red foam appeared at the corners of his lips. The Amanita rhesus was doing its work. The capillaries in his lungs were rupturing, and every breath was a spray of blood disguised as a laugh. And then a new sound filled the hall. It was a whistle, a sharp, piercing blast from a brass whistle. From the shadows of the gallery above, Pip appeared. He wasn't running. He was standing tall, and as the elite watched in frozen silence, Pip began to speak. But he didn't use his voice. He used the voices of the dead. He mimicked the scream of the man crushed in the gears. He mimicked the sob of the mother who had lost her child to the grinder's asthma. He projected the voice of Silas's wife, Mary, whispering the word murderer over and over again. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, a haunting, ghostly chorus that drowned out the dying laughter of the Iron King. In the chaos, Silas stepped forward. He reached into his tunic and produced the black ledger, not the one he gave Pip, but the ledger's companion, the book of bank drafts and illegal deeds. He tossed it onto the table in front of Holloway, the journalist, who had slipped into the hall disguised as a waiter. "The truth is in the ink," Silas cried out over the screams of the dying men. "The king is dead. The joke is over." Vane gave one last violent convulsion. His heart, pushed beyond its limit by the poison and the hysterical laughter, finally burst. He lay still on the floor, his face frozen in a permanent, terrifying grin. The Iron King had died laughing, and the blood pooled around his head like a dark velvet crown. The aftermath was a whirlwind of fire and justice. The guards, terrified by the ghosts and the sudden death of their paymaster, fled into the night. Holloway didn't waste a second. He took the ledger to the city, and by the next morning the presses were screaming the truth. The scandal toppled the local government, and the Queen's Privy Council was forced to launch an immediate investigation into the Vane foundries. Silas didn't try to run. He sat in the great hall, surrounded by the wreckage of the Jubilee, his white paint smeared with soot and blood. When the constables arrived, he held out his hands for the irons. He had committed a crime, yes. But as he was led away, he looked out the window and saw the first light of dawn breaking over the moors. The smoke from the foundries had stopped. For the first time in a decade, the air was clear. Months later, on the coast of Scarborough, a boy stood on a cliff overlooking the sea. His lungs were still weak, but the salt air was a healing balm. He was no longer a clapper boy. He was a student, funded by the Vane Reparation Fund that had been established after the king's assets were seized. In his hand, he held a tarnished brass whistle. In a cold prison cell in York, Silas Reed sat on a stone bench. The white paint was gone. His face was clean, lined with age and sorrow, but his eyes were at peace. He looked at a small sliver of moonlight on the floor. He wasn't smiling, but for the first time since the day his apothecary was taken, he felt like a man again. He knew that Pip was safe. He knew that the Iron King's throne had been ground into the dust. A crown built on the bones of the poor is only a prop, and even the loudest laughter cannot drown out the silent scream of justice. The jester had given his final performance, and the world would never be the same. Before we say goodbye to Silas and Pip, I want to thank you for staying until the end of this dark journey. If this story touched you, please leave a comment with your rating from 0 to 10. Your support means everything to us. Don't forget to subscribe and join our community for more tales from the shadows of history. Until next time, remember, the truth always finds a way to speak, even if it has to borrow a voice. The closing image is the brass whistle, resting on a windowsill in the coastal infirmary, catching the golden light of a new, cleaner dawn. The laughter had ended, but the hope was just beginning.